preface this, I really love to drive. Like hours-long drives to nowhere with no destination in mind, just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in Nebraska, I'd often take roads or lonely highways cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities, and I'd usually take these drives at night since there was less traffic to worry about. I've done it since, I've had my license 4 or 5 years ago, and I've never once had any sort of issue, nor have I ever run into any trouble. And that was until a few nights ago. For reference, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and as I've stated before, I often take these drives completely and utterly alone. But they're a good way to clear my head when I'm stressed, upset, or overwhelmed, or for me to get a plan together to sort personal issues out. I've also done these long and lonely drives to get away from the toxicity of my household when I used to live with my parents as a means of sort of coping with their alcoholism. Though, now that I've moved out and am in a much better place mentally, I don't really have the urge to get in my car and just drive anymore. However, on the night that this event took place, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious with a whole host of personal issues that I'd rather not get into. I felt restless and irritable around my boyfriend. I couldn't focus on anything else, and I just decided that I should take a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend was understanding and just told me to be careful and to not be gone for too terribly long, since it was getting pretty late and he would worry about me. I agreed, gave him a kiss goodbye, and then I left. I drove around the city for what must have been about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive furthermore down those familiar dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns at a slower pace in case a deer jumped around the bend, and was just admiring the vast empty darkness of the snow-capped fields and barren trees. It was honestly a bit creepy being all alone with no cars in sight, in seemingly the middle of nowhere, the few houses miles back from the road, lightless, and the dead cornfields withered away and covered in snow. It was like something out of a horror movie, if I'm being honest, and I sort of half expected to see a ghost pop up in my rearview mirror, or see someone clamber out from the patches of the trees dotting the horizon. The only light, though, came from my headlights, and even then I still strained to see through the inky darkness of the night. By now it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back towards the city, I would head back to the city and then home. That roundabout was still maybe about 15 to 25 minutes away, but other than my imagination picturing the worst, I wasn't really all that concerned. I mean, I was by myself. I didn't have any other motorists to worry about, right? Wrong. So as I'm rounding another bend, I notice a vehicle with its hazards flashing maybe a quarter of a mile or something away from me. It was some sort of a sedan, dark-colored, and was angled to where only part of it was on the shoulder, while the rest was jutted out onto the road, like they had to pull over in a hurry, but didn't quite manage to do that. The driver's side door was flung wide open, and as I slowed my vehicle down and angled it towards the opposite side of the road to pass, I could make out what looked like maybe blood on the inside of the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, though, and I was the only motorist in sight. Cell phone reception is spotty at best in this part of the country, but more often than not, you couldn't get reception no matter how hard you prayed, which was definitely the case when I took a glance at my phone to see if I had any service. So, a lone female on the road at night, pulling up near a vacant vehicle that looks like someone had been attacked on the inside, with no cell service. Now, I'm no dummy. I've watched countless episodes of Investigation Discovery and Criminal Minds and read far too many true crime books to know that this had bad and danger written all over it. But there was still a small part of me that worried that something terrible had happened to whoever was in that vehicle, and I thought that I needed to help. But these roads, they don't get a lot of traffic late at night, and temperatures were well below freezing. And if someone had been hurt or was in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them but me. Still, I erred on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly, and as I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my passenger window a bit, shut off the music, and called out. "Hey, anyone there? Are you okay?" I didn't hear a response. I worried that they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them, that's for sure. I told myself that I'd call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything, I would leave, and the moment that there was reception, I would call it in. And if I did hear someone, well, I'd figure out my next course of action just then. So again, I shout, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was silence for a bit, and then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, yeah." I was relieved at first, and was about to say something in response, or possibly even stop my car and get out, when I noticed three things nearly simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed that there was no damage to the hood or anywhere else on the vehicle, which I found to be strange considering the blood on the inside of the door. Then, in my rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car fast. And the person did not have any blood on them or appeared to be injured in any way. They were wearing a mask. Not like a face mask or COVID or ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks that you would see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was. I couldn't get a good look at it, but from its length and shape, my guess was that it was maybe a tire iron or a crowbar or something. I don't need to tell you, though, that as soon as I saw that, I slammed on the gas the moment that I noticed those things, and drove like a bat straight out of hell. My heart was thundering in my chest, and my entire body was shaking. My window was still rolled down in my haste, and the music was still shut off, so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, though I had no clue what they were saying. I just knew that I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow or chase me, or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me, and right before I looked away from the mirror, I then saw a second man emerge from the trees that had been rustling earlier, also wearing one of those creepy masks, and no trace of blood on him either. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but I wanted to get as far away from those men as possible as quickly as I could. As soon as I made it to the roundabout too, I turned towards town, parked in the Walmart parking lot that thankfully still had cars from who I assumed were workers closing up shop, and proceeded to have pretty much a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends, T, who was a police officer, to tell him what happened and what I should do. He was obviously concerned for me, and after asking if I was okay, where I was, did they follow me, etc., he told me since it was out of city limits that he couldn't really do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police or sheriff in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed, thanked him, and while I waited for the police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I eventually managed to tell him what happened, not even 10 or so minutes ago. He was, as you could imagine, super freaked for my safety, and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down himself to take me home. I told him the police were on their way to take my statement, so I couldn't leave and that I was okay, but I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruisers pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement, and they assured me that they would go back to the spot that I told them the sedan had been at to take a look, and that they would try to catch the guys who did it, though with no cameras and no description of the men, I wasn't sure that they'd be able to. I mean, I didn't even get the license plate number, though at the time of my panic, the thought never even came to mind until the police were asking if I got it. Which meant that all they had to go off was a dark-colored sedan and two guys with masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made in fear that it would be those guys arriving any minute to finish whatever it was they started. Since the incident, I haven't heard back from the police about whether or not they had any leads, and I'm not sure they ever will. I'm just thankful, though, that I'm still here and that I didn't stop to get out of my car that night. I'm not sure what would have become of me if I had. I still have so many questions that have no answers. I mean, what were they doing? Why? Was that blood on the inside of the car, or just a ruse to get more attention? If it was really blood, did they hurt somebody else? And what would have happened to me if I had stopped my car? Needless to say, I won't be going on any more late-night drives to anywhere. I really hope that I never cross paths with those freaks ever again. So I have 3 kids, and 2 of them, they actually have autism. And to put it simply, it's hard. Anyway, I was fast asleep a few weeks ago in bed, and I just felt like I wasn't alone in the room aside from the missus next to me asleep. We are light sleepers as our smallest wanders the house at night. But I open my eyes, and on my side of the bed, my middle child, a girl, she has autism, was just sort of standing over me, just standing there in her nightie. Hey baby, what's up? Nothing. Honey, are you okay? Nothing again. Honey, at this point I'm starting to freeze in my skin because there's like absolutely no motion or response, but she has sleepwalked before and done this before, but that was probably about 8 years ago now. Without going into too many details, I refuse to look away and I constantly look at her hands for any kind of objects. Honey, what do you want? At this point, I'm blindly nudging the missus. I'm sweating bricks because this is definitely not normal now. And I hear the missus stir and go, what? But I'm still trying to get through to my girl with no success. And this is the point where my missus turns on the bedside lamp and goes, what's up? This was also the exact moment that my daughter just vanished into thin air like vapor. And I swear to everything that is holy and true and all the gods above that I almost followed through straight in that bed. I quickly got up and checked on the kids, but all of them were fast asleep in bed. I've had a few things happen in that house, but that one was as real as the phone that I'm sharing this on now. So I was living in Berlin in Germany, and my boyfriend at that time lived about 5 hours drive away. So I had planned to go and see him, like every fortnight for the weekend, and I used the carpooling site BlaBlaCar, which I had used many times before this. I see that a young man is heading down that way and that there's already one seat taken by another girl, so I reserve my seat and wait for this person to come and fetch me. We meet up at the spot that he agreed to, and he explains to me that the other girl had to cancel last minute, which is totally fine, I suppose. Odd, but I mean, it can happen. Anyway, I jump in. The driver, Ben, seems pretty nice, talkative. Just before leaving Berlin, too, he turns to me and explains that he's forgotten his driver's license at home and that we must go and fetch it. Which is already a bit of a pain because it's on the other side of town and Berlin is big. And let's be honest, too. You know that you're going away for the whole weekend and that you have a really big journey and you forget your license. I don't know. Anyway, moving on. We get to his and he parks and turns to me and says, would you like to come in with me and visit my place? I was like, no thank you. And after about 5 minutes, off we go. He's talking away and all of a sudden starts touching my thigh and explains that he's a personal trainer and also a massager, and I was like, good for you, guy. I made it quite clear, though, that I was heading to my boyfriend's and that I was not comfortable. He continues touching my hands, my thighs, and my neck, and at that point, I was sort of like, should I get out? I mean, I am on a motorway, already about 2 hours away from Berlin, and it's traffic jammed. And so, unfortunately, 5 hours ended up being like 7 hours. My plan was to pretend that I was asleep. I thought that way I don't have to interact with him and he might just leave me alone. Thing is, I really fell asleep, and when I wake up, I realize that I am in the middle of nowhere, like on tiny roads in the middle of a forest, and the guy turns to me and says, "You know, if I wanted to, I could kidnap you and take you into the woods, right?" I played tough and I said, "You don't scare me. I'm planned for all situations." He didn't seem to take any notice, and my boyfriend rang me at that point. I explained everything, and I kept him posted. So, as we come out of these woods, he decides that it's now time to eat, so we lose another 45 minutes while he does his own thing. I basically tell him at this point too that I'm fed up and I want no more stops, and he tells me that he's tired and that in order to do so and keep himself awake, I must massage him. I felt totally stuck, so I briefly touched his neck as in to say, "Now move." Eventually we arrived finally, and my boyfriend was not there waiting for me because I didn't want him to get into a fight. But I got out of the car quickly, and I reported him to the carpooling site, and he's now been banned. I really hope too that this never happens to anyone else because, let me tell you, while I put up a pretty tough exterior, I was definitely panicking on the inside. Last year, after a blissful first year of living in a new apartment, all on my own for the first time as well, a man moved in next door that I will never forget. So the layout of my apartment is pretty crucial to understanding this incident. The most important part is that my balcony and his balcony are only partially separated by a wall. There's a solid 2-foot gap in which you can actually easily walk from one side to the other. For context too, I previously had a very lovely woman living next door for the entire first year that I lived there, who never crossed this balcony threshold without being explicitly invited. I only throw this in there so that you can understand that I wasn't previously concerned about someone infiltrating my space. So the first time that I met this new neighbor though, he was unloading some groceries from his massive truck into the assigned parking spot next to mine. As I was driving up, he and a girl that I assumed to be his girlfriend were unloading boxes from Costco. I noticed them speaking, and as soon as I was out of the car, they just sort of went silent. I nodded to them, proceeded to the elevator, and the guy ran up behind me, threw some boxes down, and begged me to wait. And no problem, I thought. I'm a good neighbor after all. While in the elevator, though, the girlfriend refused to make eye contact with me or speak to me. It was a little weird, but I just thought that maybe she was shy. But he quickly introduced himself and was extremely chatty. In the 45 seconds it takes to get to the floor where our apartments were, he asked how I liked the place, where I was from, and where I worked and whatnot. Looking back on this too, his enthusiasm was a little bit strange, but I chalked it up to him being excited to be in a new place. But for the sake of the rest of the story though, I'll call this guy Sam. So Sam was maybe 33, I would guess, 6 feet tall with a slim muscular build and had hair buzzed extremely short, as if to mask his balding, I would suppose. A pretty average looking guy by all accounts though. So the first few weeks we sort of run into each other often, and he always makes small talk and always refers to me as Miss. I assume it's because he forgot my name but wanted to be polite. I almost never see his girlfriend after the first night, but occasionally I can hear him talking to a lady in his apartment as the walls are reasonably thin. One night, though, about 3 months after Sam moved in, my boyfriend is spending the night and we're watching movies on the couch. It's maybe 11:30 at night. The back of my couch is against the wall that I share with Sam, and we hear some banging noises. My first thought is that Sam and his girlfriend must be getting it on. Her boyfriend and I just sort of laugh and turn the volume up a bit to drown them out. But then, in addition to the banging, the neighbours begin screaming. We can hear objects being thrown, glass shattered. The words are muffled, but there is distinctively anger and crying going on for sure. My boyfriend, gem that he is, steps onto the semi-shared balcony and in his loudest voice yells over, without crossing into Sam's balcony, mind you, "Everything okay over there?" The girl opens the sliding glass door on Sam's side a minute or two later and says, "Sorry about that." So we just sort of leave it alone after that. I'm concerned for sure, but we have no idea what actually happened, and so we just decide to go to bed. A big mistake, I know. So I wake up at around, I would say 3 in the morning to more screaming. But my boyfriend refuses to wake up, and I'm about to take my 5-foot self to break up whatever is going on at 3 in the morning. I consider calling the police, but was so drowsy that I convinced myself that I dreamt it, and I deeply regret that decision. The next morning, I woke up to some terrible personal news, an entirely unrelated death of a friend, and pretty much put the events of that night on the back burner. What I mean by this is that I didn't forget it, but it also just wasn't on my mind at the time. So fast forward about another 2 weeks, it's a warm day and I'm outside reading a book in a robe, a sports bra and shorts. I'm in a chair that faces away from Sam's apartment, so I can't see his side from where I am. I'm deep into my book when suddenly I get tapped on the shoulder. Sam is standing behind me and asks if we can talk for a second. Now, this man has already crossed an albeit invisible line by coming on my side of the balcony, but I also can't get to my door without physically moving him aside, so I ask him what's going on. He told me that it was his birthday and asked if I knew where to get some weed because I seem like the girl who knows how to have a good time. As we live in a state where weed is legal, I told him that I'm sure Google would provide the best dispensary in the area, but I personally didn't have any. He proceeds to tell me how drunk he got last night, and at this point I'm itching for an exit. As I start to move, as if to signal that I'm done talking, he reaches out for my shoulder and tells me that he scratched my car last night because he was driving very, very wasted. Remember his massive truck? And he says all of this with a smile on his face, almost laughing. I'm surprised, but mostly want to get away from him because my creep senses are starting to tingle and I didn't want to blow up at him for hitting my car and whatnot. But then he says that he'll send me his insurance info if I give him my number, and thankfully, I knew that that would be a bad call. I make a bad nervous joke about knowing where he lived and said that if the damage was bad enough that I would knock on his door and get his insurance. He counters this by saying that he'll leave a note with his info on my door, and then he retreats from my balcony while also saying that he'd prefer to just pay me in cash and not involve insurance if possible. So I give it about, I would say, an hour or so, and then I head down to assess the damage. I did this because I didn't want to walk down at the same time as him, risk having him follow me and whatnot. And sure enough, there are 2 really long new scratches on the driver's door. They're not deep, but just kind of superficial, or worthy of a call to insurance immediately. I really just didn't want to get involved with him in any way, so I decided that I could deal with the scratches. But this little event has kind of shaken me for sure. And at this point, I definitely knew that something was off with him, but nothing unusual happens as far as I'm aware of that night. So the next day is Saturday, and as I had to work the next day, I was home alone watching some action-y movies, and it's around 11 p.m. I'm on my sofa with my cat curled up on me, and the movie is relatively loud, so it takes me a little while to register this banging noise coming from the hallway of my apartment building. I honestly only noticed it because my cat had woken up and got all puffed up and freaked out. I turned down the volume of the film, and suddenly the banging is getting louder and louder. And just as I stand up, I hear the 5 words that no one wants to hear coming from their door. I hear, "Open up, it's the police." My stomach instantly dropped to the floor. I had lied to Sam the day before, and I totally had weed, and I had smoked a joint outside on the balcony, the part furthest away from Sam's, maybe 20 minutes before then. I'm totally panicked, high as a kite, and trying to control my breathing, so I don't immediately come off as suspicious before I answer the door. I remember checking the peephole to see a close-up of the cop's face, and then opening the door, coming face to face with 6 officers, all with guns drawn, mind you. I'm about 0.5 seconds away from completely pissing my pants in fear, still convinced that I'm somehow in trouble for smoking a joint. The officer, who seems to be in charge, can sense instantly the level of my panic, and he says, "Ma'am, you're not in trouble. We need to speak with you about your neighbor, though. Can we come in?" At this point, I'm just sort of reeling, and my whole being is tense. I let the cops in, though, but my heart hasn't moved from my throat. The policeman in charge, though, asks me about any interactions with Sam. I tell them that I barely know him, that he just lives next to me, only moved in a few months ago. I ask why they needed me to be in my apartment. I'm scared, but also I don't really typically get along with the cops, and I do have the right to know why 6 of them practically wave their guns in my face. And the lead officer proceeds to tell me that Sam is a bad guy. He apparently beat his girlfriend so badly the night prior that she was now in the ICU for her injuries. They also told me that Sam had a gun and had barricaded himself in the apartment next to mine. They said that they had spoken to my building manager and knew that my place had access to his balcony and they needed to use it. Then they asked me to go into my bedroom and lock the doors, turn the lights off, and the next 30 to 45 minutes were absolute hell. In my panic, I had left my cell phone on my kitchen counter and I had to sit in my room just listening to the commotion. No shots were ever fired, thankfully, but there was a lot of yelling and what sounded like things being thrown. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, the main officer knocked on my door and told me that Sam had been arrested and thanked me for letting them use my apartment. They asked me questions for maybe 15 more minutes, but after that they left. And man, do I wish that this is where the story ended, but there's still a bit more to this. So in the days following Sam's arrest, I became even more panicked about him coming back to the apartment building, worried about retaliation. I hadn't said anything to the police to technically incriminate him. I had proof of nothing, in fact, except his word that he was the one who scratched my car, but I didn't tell them about the night my boyfriend and I heard them fight. About 5 days later, Sam reappeared at the building as I was coming home from work one evening. He tried to approach me, but the elevator shut just as he was running to catch it, and my whole body got tense, like the feeling when you get when you come close to getting in a car accident but narrowly avoid it. I stayed off my balcony entirely from this point, though, and always kept the curtains closed. We didn't speak or really even see each other at all for another few weeks, and then we had our final interaction. So Sam stopped me in the parking lot one night, running after me as I was about to get into the elevator. He begged me to tell him why I let the cops in that night, and I told him the honest truth, that I was stoned, didn't know what to do, and had a bad history with cops. This is all true, mind you, and again I was concerned about him trying to retaliate. He then got pretty upset and kept trying to repeat the question, obviously wanting a different answer. When I couldn't give him one, he then offered me $3,000 to testify as a character witness on his behalf because I knew him and knew how he really treated women. I was just sort of speechless and very freaked out as well. He told me that his hearing was next Thursday morning, and he asked if I would show up. I was like a deer frozen in headlights for a moment, and then somehow got the hell out of there after mumbling a string of words that were most likely incoherent. But the Wednesday night before this trial, I came home from work, and my cat was acting kind of weird, like something had just spooked her, and her tail was all puffed out. I kind of shook it off, but I noticed through the curtains that there was something taped to the outside of my sliding glass door, and apparently Sam had left a post-it with his phone number and name, and underneath, "I'm counting on you." Needless to say, I never showed up. I took a photo of the post-it, grabbed my cat, locked all my doors, and stayed at my mum's house for about 5 days after that happened. I did phone the police to let them know that he'd been on my balcony again, but they never followed up with anything. And eventually my boyfriend came and we went back to my place together, and everything was as it should have been. I never did see Sam again after that, but a few weeks later, a lady that I'd never seen before was cleaning out his apartment. And maybe a month after that, new people moved in and things have just been normal ever since. I tried calling the police and the county jail to see if he was in lockup again, but no one was able to release information to me, unfortunately. I'm hoping that means that he's actually in there, if he did what the police said that he did, that is. But whatever the case, in an attempt to discover if Sam had been evicted, or if he had gone to jail, the manager of the place disclosed that the girlfriend did pull through. I never knew her name, so I couldn't actually follow up with trying to see if she was okay with the local hospitals. But the manager did tell me that Sam was made an exception to break his lease, but he couldn't confirm whether or not that he was in jail. Which means that, thankfully, he probably won't be coming back. My mum's side of the family has always been far more close and extensive, more of a community than my dad's side, because they live all in one region and most of them stay there for their entire lives. My grandma has many family friends, one especially close to my mum and gran, who I'm going to call Carla. She had been married to a man called Norman for a decade or two. I'm not sure how long exactly, and our families were always extremely close. We would see them every time we went up north. Norman used to be a kids' entertainer as well, extremely good with children and always looking after them, but not me and my siblings. My dad, after living in a crap hole for 17 years, didn't trust anyone alone or even supervising with his kids, and was extremely protective, even with close family members, which, man, am I glad for now. So a few months ago, we learned that Norman and Carla had broken up, which is weird for pensioners. And when she saw my gran and my gran asked her why, she started crying and saying something very bad had happened. And my gran knew that it must have been something very dark. She could just tell. In the present, me and my mum and my aunt are in our villa in Europe when my uncle texts the group chat with an article saying that Norman had been arrested for molesting a child from ages 4 to 16, aka he was sexually assaulting them for more than a decade, and also found CP on his laptop. Bearing in mind, Carla had no idea that she was with a pedophile, and now could clearly make sense of why his 2 children were estranged from him, although never proven. But she had left her children and grandchildren alone with him. Many people had, in fact, and at ages where they were probably too young to remember. So we may never know the extent of the amount of assaults that took place, but no one, and I mean no one, expected this man to be a pedophile. Literally, everyone thought that he was just a really great guy. My dad then said a few days after it came out that he wanted to babysit me and my younger sister when we were 4 or 5, when my dad was going to a party one day. But my dad's alarm bells went off for some reason, saying that he had felt the same way that he had when Jimmy Seville's assistant told him that Jimmy was a bad man. That's another story. And so in the end, he said no, and never ended up going to this party. But I shudder just imagining what may have happened if he hadn't have listened to his instincts, and it honestly just makes me feel sick. I guess it just goes to show that your gut feeling is right sometimes, and that my dad, he truly is a great dad.